Charles Butler, a New York attorney and agent of the Canal bondholders, proposed a compromise to resolve the issues. Laboring for over a year, the legislature finally approved the Butler Bill on January 27, 1847. One of the more popular features of the bill was a clause providing for the completion of the Wabash and Erie from the lakes to the Ohio River. The work of extension proceeded slowly. The canal was opened to Terre Haute in 1849 and was completed to Evansville in the spring of 1853. It extended a distance of 450 miles, the longest man-made waterway in America. Although we sometimes think of the Indiana canals simply as big ditches, they actually were complex works of engineering. Digging a ditch to carry off excess water is one thing. Building a canal that can carry commercial boat traffic is another. The Indiana canals were built about 40 feet wide at the waterline and 26 feet wide at the bottom. The water was 4 feet deep. These were the minimum specifications, and the waterways were often built larger when it was convenient. Feeder dams were built to supply water to the canal from the major rivers and creeks, and there were waste gates built in the towpath of the canal to let out excess water. Because they had to be kept level, the canals could not be built in straight lines like roads and railroads, but they had to follow the contours of the land, curving around hills and valleys, keeping always to the same elevation. Many short canals were built this way without locks, but eventually on the longer routes, the changes in elevation became too great, and something had to be done. The solution was the pound lock, or lift lock. This consisted of a chamber, built from stone or timber, and big enough to hold a canal boat. In Indiana, these were about 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. At both ends of the lock were watertight gates that would shut off the connection with the upper or lower level. These lock gates were made of wood, with huge balance beams that served as levers for opening or closing the gates. For a boat to ascend the lock, the upper gates had to be closed and the water let out of the chamber until it was even with the lower level. Then the lower gates were opened, and the boat pulled into the lock. The lower gates were closed, and the wicket gates were opened in the upper lock gates to let water into the chamber. As the water rose to the same height as the upper level, the boat floated on the water, so when the chamber was completely full, the upper gates could be opened, and the boat pulled out of the chamber and on through the canal. Sometimes the canal would have to cross a stream or creek, and this was done by building a culvert under the canal to carry the water of the stream. Culverts were sometimes made of cut stone as an arch, such as this one at Prairie Creek near Peru. On smaller streams, a wooden box culvert was used, built so that it was submerged in the water of the stream to keep the wood from rotting. These pictures show how the wooden culverts were built. When the canal had to cross a large creek or a river, a bridge was built to carry the canal water in a wooden trough. This was called an aqueduct, and the Duck Creek Aqueduct on the Whitewater Canal at Metamora is a good example of the covered bridge type of aqueduct. Another type of aqueduct that was used on Indiana canals was the open trunk type, which had no roof. Here we see a painting of the large Eel River Aqueduct at Logansport on the Wabash-Erie Canal. The boats were pulled along by horses or mules, who walked along a towpath that ran along one side of the canal. When the canal passed over an aqueduct, a platform was built out over the water from one end of the aqueduct to the other so the animals could pull the boat through. The animals were hitched to a tow line, a heavy rope about 90 or 100 feet long, which was made fast to the boat. Sometimes a river would be dammed up to raise the level and slow down the current, and the boats would be locked into the river and pulled across by the animals walking on a bridge. Here we see the wooden outlet lock to the Maumee River at Defiance, Ohio, with the towpath bridge in the background. This is similar to the arrangements near Delphi on the Wabash and on the White River near Newberry. Canal boats in Indiana were privately owned, and nearly any type of boat could and did use the canals. Sometimes a farmer would take goods to town in a canoe or a rowboat, and timber was made up into big rafts that floated down the canals to the sawmills. The larger the boat, the more goods it could carry, and the more money could be made on each trip. There was a real economic advantage to using large boats. However, the boat could not be any larger than the locks it had to pass through, so the largest boats were about 90 feet long and 14 feet wide. Commercial boats came in 3 primary types. Most glamorous were the packets, or passenger boats. These were fitted up with a large cabin that took up most of the space on board. There was a small platform at the rear of the boat for the steersman, and another at the front. Passengers could sit or stand on the roof of the cabin when the weather was good, but they had to be on the lookout for low bridges. The packets usually traveled non-stop on long trips, and the horses were changed with fresh teams at intervals. It took about 60 hours for a packet boat to travel on the Wabash-Erie Canal from Lafayette to Toledo. In a letter written in 1851, a young lady of Louisville, Kentucky described a trip with her brother through Indiana on a Wabash-Erie packet boat.
We went on board by way of a board, a gangplank that is, and soon found ourselves in a dark hole-like room where it was hard to breathe and impossible to see plainly. There was a queer smell. Tom says all canal boats have that odor. Of course, this being my first experience, I cannot say how true that is. We presently went up a steep little stairway and came out upon the top of the boat, which was already in motion, very slow motion though, and the dingy houses began to slide so it looked back to the rear. A single horse pulls our vessel, and the loutish boy who manages him has hair as white as tow. Sometimes the horse pokes along, sometimes the boy makes it trot for a short distance. I'm sitting on a stool on top of the boat, writing with my paper on my knee. The mosquitoes bother me some, but they are not very thick. The first lock that we went through caused me to have a very queer feeling. Our boat entered a place where the sides of the canal were walled up with logs and plank and stopped before a gate. At the same time, a gate was closed astern of us, and then the boat began to rise up as the front of the gate was slowly opened. By this means, we were lifted to a higher level upon which we proceeded. But when the boat began to rise, I felt as though something dreadful was about to happen. We have passed through some lovely country where rich farms like those in some parts of Tennessee stretch away as far as you can look. On our left, a short distance away, the Wabash River has been in sight most of the time, and beyond it, large fields of bottom land waving with luxuriant young corn. On our right, the farms are more rolling in places, but fertile and well kept. To get to the dining room, I have to climb up a ladder through a hole in the top of the boat, and then go down through another hole into a suffocating box. The table is horrid, so is the cooking. Pork and bread and pork, and then some greasy fish, mackerel, and bitter coffee, lukewarm, 3 times each day. I am raving hungry all the time, and nothing fit to eat. It makes me violently angry to see Tom gorge like a pig and pretend that stewed beans and catfish are delicious. The little towns along by the canal are forlorn-looking places, but they seem to be doing business. Tom says that some of the men are getting rich. I do not see the evidence of it if they are. For hours today we sneaked along the prairie. I think that sneaked exactly expresses it, for the boat acted as though it wanted to creep up to something and take it unaware. The public roads in many places run along close to the towpath of the canal, and I see people in wagons. They go faster than we do. I am outrageously tired, but Tom is delighted. It seems to suit him exactly.
Another type of canal craft was the line boat. These would carry both freight and passengers, although the passenger accommodations were not as comfortable as those on the packets. Line boats often carried their own spare teams in a stable on board. Freight boats also traveled on the canals, carrying only freight, but often with a small cabin for the crew who lived on board. Many of the canal boats were owned by large companies, which operated whole fleets of boats, but many others were owned by the people who ran them. Sometimes whole families lived on the boats, with the children helping to drive the animals on the towpath. Canaling may seem romantic to us today, but to those kids who spent their whole childhood following the mules on the towpath, it was probably not much fun. The period from 1847 to 1856 may be regarded as the heyday of Indiana's canals. Until 1853, there was a steady increase in income from tolls and water rents, and a decreasing annual average cost of repairs and maintenance. In 1852, tolls and rents reached their highest amount, $193,400. With a waiting market in the East and an economical means of transportation, Indiana farm products became valuable export commodities. Wagon loads of grain, flour, pork products, hay, beans, butter, hides, feathers, wool, tobacco, and whiskey were loaded onto eastbound canal boats to be traded for Eastern manufactured products. Hardware, farm tools, salt, sugar, sewing machines, pianos, dried fish, cloth, furniture, and other manufactured goods flowed into Indiana. Towns along the canals became important trade centers. Large storehouses were built to store the produce that was hauled to the canals. Long trains of wagons waited by the hour at these rising commercial centers for their turn to unload the products of the farm and countryside. At Lafayette, 400 wagons unloading during a single day was not unusual. Promising canal towns such as LaGros, Attica, Americus, Lockport, Pittsburgh, and Metamora sprang into existence during the canal's heyday, but lapsed into relative obscurity with the passing of the canal era. With the constant flow of European settlers, other newcomers flocked to Indiana from the old northeastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Settlers also arrived from southern Indiana, southern Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas. By 1850, the population would grow to 988,000, a threefold increase from 350,000 in 1832. Available water power encouraged many varied industries. Every town along the canal had its warehouses, grain elevators, pork packing houses, hotels, and mercantile establishments. Manufacturers produced everything from barrels and barrel staves to iron stoves, furniture, and pottery. Strong ties were being forged with the eastern states as a result of the canal's stimulating business and encouraging immigration. It was a significant step in turning the business interests of Indiana toward the eastern seaboard. With a population hailing largely from the Northeast, and with markets in that direction, both business and political interests became closely knit with those of the North and East. Although the canals had ushered in a new and prosperous time for many parts of Indiana, Their days were numbered, almost from the start. Back in the 1830s, when the internal improvement system was being planned, it was argued that the technology of canals had been well proved by many years of use, both in Europe and America, while railroads were newfangled, unreliable, and had to be built with iron rails imported from England. By the 1840s, iron rails were being made in the United States, resulting in reduced construction costs. By the 1850s, after almost 40 years of development, the steam locomotive was a powerful and reliable machine. The canals, on the other hand, did not turn out to be nearly as reliable as had been hoped. When the Wabash-Erie Canal was built, it was intended that all of the structures, such as locks and culverts, would be made of cut stone in a permanent fashion, as had been the accepted practice on earlier waterways. Unfortunately, the engineers could not find any good building stone in the upper Wabash Valley, so the locks and other structures were built of timber. The estimated life of a timber lock was only about 15 years, but timber was cheap and plentiful, and there were also plenty of woodworkers. The plan was to rebuild them with cut stone shipped in on the canal itself after good quarries were found. An excellent quarry was found at Georgetown near Logansport, but the canal was not opened to Georgetown until 1839, when the state was already in serious financial trouble. South of Lafayette, there were other problems. The canal was opened to Evansville in 1853. 3 years later, on May 28, 1856, the editor of the Evansville Inquirer wrote,
"The break in the canal which occurred at Feazle's Ferry a few weeks since, and which had been repaired, has again given way. No prospect for a resumption of navigation within 2 weeks. This accident will increase the distress along the canal, as much pork, lard, bacon, etc., had been unloaded from flat boats on the White River and Patoka and hauled to the canal."
On August 16th, the editor of the Evansville Journal wrote,
"The breaks are all mended, but navigation cannot yet be resumed on account of the scarcity of water. The quantity in the canal is insufficient for navigation purposes, and the water in White River being lower than the bottom of the canal, none can be supplied until a rise occurs. There are over a dozen boats aground at different points that cannot be moved until more water can be supplied."
On the 28th of August, the Inquirer reported,
"The canal boat Flying Cloud arrived Monday night and reports only 8 inches of water in the summit. Until the canal rises, no loaded boats can pass. She was hauled through by 3 teams."
3 months later, in November, the Inquirer complained,
"The canal has broken again, as usual. If the trustees do not put a new superintendent on the division about Petersburg, the work might as well be abandoned at once. The man Wright, who now has charge, does not care one fig whether there is 1 drop of water in the canal below his mill or not, so that way he can make money out of it."
1857 was no better. At Kossuth in Clay County, somebody hacked off the balance beams of the lock several times and cut the canal bank, draining out the water. In 1858, the Wabash flooded, causing extensive damage. Vandalism was also a serious problem. In 1860, after several attempts, the Birch Creek Reservoir, a major water supply, was cut and drained by local residents. This effectively ended navigation in the crosscut. It was correctly believed that the high incidence of miasma, or malaria, in the region had something to do with the proximity of the many acres of shallow, stagnant water in the reservoirs. While state-employed doctors reported that the reservoirs were healthy, the farmers were busy with their spades, blasting powder, and dynamite. Each year, the state engineers filed reports assuring that the canal could be put back into full operation at the cost of only a few $1,000s. Meanwhile, banks washed out and lock gates rotted. Railroads were being built to many of the cities along the canal, and as they gradually took over more and more of the shipping, the Wabash Erie was abandoned, piece by piece. In 1860, 16 years after the first canal boats reached Terre Haute, the canal ended there. By 1868, navigation stopped at Armiesburg in Park County. Yet, with incredible vitality, the Wabash Erie remained open through the 1860s. In 1871, the St. Mary's Aqueduct at Fort Wayne was completely rebuilt, and other repairs were made. But it was too late. In 1872, the Rocky Mountain left the village of Lodi in Park County, bound for Toledo. She was the last boat to make it that far. A historical marker at Fort Wayne notes that the last canal boat seen in that area was in 1882. In Pittsburgh, where the Wabash Dam had created a water-powered industrial center, another marker states that the dam was blown up in 1881, and that ended it.